Emma had always loved old things. The way they carried history in their cracks and faded edges. That's why she couldn't resist the dusty photo album tucked behind a loose floorboard in her new apartment. The building was ancient, with creaking pipes and shadows that lingered too long, but she'd fallen in love with its charm. Sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor, she flipped open the album's brittle pages, the scent of mildew curling into the air. Most of the photos were unremarkable, black and white snapshots of strangers in stiff poses, their faces blurred by time, but one image made her pause. It showed a group of people standing in front of her building, their clothes dated, their expressions oddly deliberate. Emma's breath caught. Their eyes, every single one of them, seemed to lock onto hers, as if they could see her through the decades. She laughed uneasily, tracing the photo with her fingertips. Weird, she muttered. As a photographer, she knew how angles and lighting could play tricks. Still, the longer she stared, the heavier the air around her grew. A draft slithered through the room, though the windows were shut. Shaking her head, she closed the album and shoved it onto a shelf, telling herself it was just her imagination. But that night, as she lay in bed, the silence of the apartment felt suffocating. She could have sworn the faint sound of shuffling came from the living room. Like someone slowly turning the pages of a book. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, refusing to acknowledge the chill creeping up her spine. It was just an old photo. Nothing more. Emma tucked the photo album under her arm, the weight of it suddenly feeling heavier than before. She had dismissed the strange sensation of being watched as paranoia, but now, as she flipped open the album to the same page, her breath caught in her throat. The figures in the photo had moved. Not just subtly, they were noticeably closer, their faces now filling more of the frame. Their once blank stares had sharpened into glares, their mouths twisted into cruel, knowing smiles. Emma's fingers trembled as she traced the edge of the photograph, half expecting the figures to lurch forward at her touch. She called Jake, her voice unsteady as she described what she'd seen. He laughed it off, insisting it was a prank, maybe a trick of layered exposure or digital editing. People don't just move in photos, Em, he said, but the doubt in his voice didn't reassure her. That night, as she lay in bed, the walls of her apartment seemed to press in around her. The shadows stretched longer than they should have, and more than once, she swore she heard the faintest rustle, like someone shifting their weight just out of sight. The next morning, Emma woke to find the photo album lying open on her nightstand. She hadn't left it there. Her pulse pounded as she looked at the image again. The figures had advanced still further, their hands now raised as if reaching for the camera. For her, a cold dread settled in her chest. This wasn't a prank, something was wrong, deeply terrifyingly wrong, and whatever it was getting closer. Emma woke with a start, her skin prickling with cold sweat. The whispers had returned, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to seep from the walls. She sat up, clutching her blanket, and strained to listen. The sound was coming from the dresser where she'd left the old photo album. It was faint but unmistakable, a chorus of hushed voices that carried an eerie, unnatural cadence. She forced herself to stand, her legs trembling as she approached the album. The moment her fingers brushed the worn leather cover, the whispers stopped. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Emma exhaled shakily, telling herself it was just her imagination, until she noticed the photo. The black and white image was no longer tucked safely inside the album. It lay face up on her bedside table, the figures now standing at the very steps of her apartment building. Their faces, once distant and blurred, were now clear. Expressions twisted into something between hunger and malice. One figure's hand rested on the door handle, its fingers curled as if ready to turn it. Emma's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't possible. Photos didn't change. Yet the evidence was right there, undeniable. When Jake arrived the next morning, she thrust the photo at him, her voice barely steady. "Look at it. Tell me I'm not crazy." He studied it, his brow furrowing. "Okay, this is weird," he admitted, "but someone could have doctored it. Maybe it's a prank." Emma shook her head. "It's moving, Jake. Every time I look away they get closer." He hesitated, then sighed. "All right, let's figure out where this album came from. Maybe that'll explain something." They spent the day digging through old building records and questioning neighbors. The trail led them to a reclusive former tenant named Miriam Lowe, who had disappeared without a trace years ago. One elderly neighbor, Mrs. Daly, lowered her voice as she spoke. Miriam was obsessed with that album, said it was alive. Then one day, she just wasn't here anymore. Emma's blood ran cold. The photo's figures hadn't just moved, they were coming for her. And they were almost at her door. Emma's hands trembled as she flipped through the brittle pages of the landlord's records, the musty smell of old paper thick in the air. The name jumped out at her like a warning: Daniel Mercer. The previous tenant of her apartment. The one who had vanished without a trace. Her throat tightened as she read the police report tucked between the pages. No signs of struggle, no explanation, just gone. Jake leaned over her shoulder, his breath warm against her ear. "This is creepy as hell," he muttered, but Emma barely heard him. Her eyes were locked on the scribbled note at the bottom of the report found in the apartment 1 photo album. Contents disturbed. Back home, Emma spread the album open on her kitchen table, her pulse racing. The photo of the figures outside her building seemed to pulse under her fingertips. This time she noted something new, a faint handwritten date on the back, October 31st, 1982, the night Daniel disappeared. A cold realization slithered down her spine. The figures in the photo weren't just watching her, they were waiting. Every time she looked away, they moved. Every time she blinked, they crept closer. And now they were no longer at the doorstep, they were on the stairs. Jake's face paled as he stared at the photo. "This isn't just some prank," he whispered. "This is something else." Emma's fingers dug into the table. The curse was real. The album was a snare, and the figures, whatever they were coming for her. She turned to the last page and gasped. A new photo had appeared. A shadowy figure, barely visible, stood in the corner of her bedroom. The caption beneath it read, "Almost time." Emma's hands trembled as she clutched the matchbox, the sulfur scent sharp in the air. Jake stood beside her, his jaw set with determination, but his eyes betrayed his fear. The photo album lay open on the kitchen table, the cursed image glaring up at them. The figures now so close they nearly filled the frame, their hollow eyes burning with malice. "We have to do this now," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the frantic pounding of her heart. She struck the match, the tiny flame flickering to life. For a moment, hope surged through her. But as she touched the fire to the album's edge, the flame sputtered and died, as if snuffed out by an unseen force. The figures in the photo twisted in silent screams, their mouths stretching wide in soundless agony. The air grew thick, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on Emma's chest. Then came the shadows, long creeping tendrils slithering from the corners of the room. The temperature plummeted, their breaths forming frosty clouds. Jake gasped, backing away as the shadows thickened, coalescing into humanoid shapes. The entities were no longer confined to the photo. They were here. Emma's pulse roared in her ears as the shadows advanced, their movements unnaturally smooth, gliding across the floor like smoke. The walls groaned, the ceiling creaked, as if the apartment itself were bending to their will. She grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him toward the door, but the shadows moved faster. One lashed out, wrapping around Jake's ankle like a vise. He cried out, stumbling, and Emma lunged for him. But it was too late. The shadows yanked him down, dragging him toward the album. The last thing she saw was Jake's terrified face as the photo swallowed him whole, his scream echoing in the suddenly silent room. The album snapped shut. Emma was alone, except for the shadows, now circling her, their hollow eyes gleaming with hunger. The air in Emma's apartment turned icy as the spectral figures peeled themselves from the photo's edges, their forms no longer confined to the flat, yellowed paper. They stood before her, their hollow eyes burning with an otherworldly hunger, their skeletal fingers twitching in anticipation. The room seemed to warp around them, the walls pulsating as though alive. Jake shouted something, but his voice was drowned out by the rising static of the whispers. Now deafening, now all-consuming. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps as she backed against the wall, her pulse throbbing in her throat. Before she could react, one of the entities lunged. Jake threw himself in front of her, but it was no use. The creature's claw, like hands, closed around his arm, and with a sickening lurch, he was yanked forward. His scream was cut short as the photo seemed to stretch outward, swallowing him whole. The edges of the image rippled like water, and then he was gone, nothing left but the echo of his terror. Emma's stomach dropped, the figures turned toward her, their smiles widening impossibly, their teeth jagged and blackened. Staggering back, Emma's mind raced. Burning the album had failed. Running was futile, they were already in her home, in her head. But then she remembered the way the photo had consumed Jake. If the curse trapped its victims inside the image, maybe the only way to break it was from within. Her hands trembled as she reached for the photo, now lying discarded on the floor. The figures paused, tilting their heads in unison, as if amused by her desperation. A cold resolve settled over her. If this was the only way, she had to take it. With one last glance at the horrors surrounding her, Emma pressed her fingers to the photo's surface, and the world tore open. Emma's breath hitched as the shadows coiled around her ankles, their touch like ice. The figures from the photo had fully materialized, their hollow eyes burning into hers. Jake's scream ripped through the air as one of them seized him, dragging him toward the album's open page. His fingers clawed at the floor, but it was futile. His body twisted, stretched, and then he was gone, swallowed by the photograph. The remaining entities turned their attention to Emma, their mouths stretching into grotesque smiles. She knew there was no escape left. Trembling, Emma lunged for the album, her fingers was brushing the edge of the cursed photo. If she couldn't destroy it from the outside, Maybe she could break the curse from within. The whispers grew louder, urging her forward. With one final gasp, she pressed her palm against the image, and the world lurched. A sickening pull wrenched her body, as if she were being folded into paper. The apartment dissolved around her, replaced by a grayscale landscape, frozen in time. The air was thick and stagnant, the ground unnaturally still beneath her feet. She wasn't alone. The figures surrounded her, their faces twisted in perpetual torment. Among them stood Jake, his eyes wide with silent horror. Emma tried to scream, but no sound escaped. Her body stiffened, her limbs locking into place as the curse took hold. The world beyond the photo, her world, faded into darkness. Weeks later, a new tenant moved into the apartment. While unpacking, they stumbled upon a dusty photo album wedged beneath the bed. The first photo showed a group of people standing outside the building, their expressions twisted in agony. The tenant squinted. Was it their imagination, or had the figures just shifted closer? And why did the two newest additions, a woman with wild, fearful eyes and a man with a frozen scream, seem so familiar? The album snapped shut on its own. The whispering began again.